Hello, everybody. It's Chris Littlefield from Beyond Thank You, and I am more than excited to be joined by Kim Scott today. So Kim is the author of Just Work, How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity, and one of my all-time favorite books, Radical Candor, and she's the co-founder of a company by the same name. So Kim was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies, and she was a member of the faculty at Apple University. And before that, led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. And prior, which I think is one of the most interesting things, is Kim managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Excited to be here. And so, how did you go from working in diamond cutting to working in Google?
It was a circuitous path, very unplanned. I studied Russian literature in college and moved to Moscow after college and wound up, I was interested in arms control actually at first. And so I was
Diamond cutting, arms control, same thing.
Yeah, same thing. One flows naturally to the other. I was studying sort of military conversion, swords into plowshares, and working for a company called Battery March, which was investing U.S. pension fund money in these this was back in the Soviet Union, in these Soviet defense plants that were converting from military to civilian production. And then the coup happened, and Battery March decided to put its money in China. And I decided I wanted to stay in Moscow, so I did, and I wound up getting a job with this diamond firm. And that was actually where I got interested in management. I was having drinks with these. I was supposed to hire these diamond cutters, and I thought it was going to be easy. You just pay people. That's all there is to it. And they said, no, we want to have a picnic. I'm like, well, okay, I can do picnics too. And so we were having this picnic in the outskirts of Moscow. And all of a sudden I realized that what they wanted from me, by the time we got to the bottom of a bottle of vodka, what they wanted from me was not just money. They wanted to know that someone gave a damn, that if things went sideways in Moscow, that I would help get them and their families out. And as you can imagine, since Russia invaded Ukraine, I've been thinking a lot about these folks and have unfortunately lost touch with them. But that was sort of when I realized that management actually mattered and that it was interesting. It was not just about dollars and cents. It was about care personally and challenge directly. But after 4 years in Moscow, I was pretty burnt out. So I came back, stateside.
Why?
Yeah. It was a lot. It was a lot. Came back stateside, went to business school, did a few failed startups, and then wound up going to Google. So that's how it all happened.
Amazing. What a transition. And so back to that story with the diamond cutters, what was it? Because I think I remember, and I think you share that story in the book about the thing that they wanted most was during these unstable times to know that someone was going to be able to take care of them and their family.
Yeah, to know that someone gave a damn.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
What I was going to say, that element of that caring personally and getting down to that, hey, I want to do this thing, go out for drinks. And instead, I want to do the thing that's important to me. And I want to celebrate the way that we celebrate and drink. Well, I used to work in the Republic of Georgia a lot, and it was cha-cha, which was the drink, and everybody's toasting each other and doing that. And you're having meat and the shish kebabs over the fire. So how did the conversation progress from, okay, we're drinking and you're going to work for us, to I want you to be able to help my family get out and help me, possibly get a visa somewhere else if something happens?
We were, I think, drinking too much vodka, something I no longer do, but did a lot of
liquid courage, right?
Yeah, or something. But we started talking about a wide range of things. It sort of opened up. We were not just talking about come work for this American company, but we were talking about what it had been like for them over the past few years, because those were really, those were some pretty rough times. I mean, probably not as strange and awful as what's happening right now, but as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a tremendous uncertainty about what the future held. And also, I think the other thing that we forget now is that there was tremendous optimism in those times. Like this was proof that democracy would win, and that totalitarianism didn't work, you know. And so anyway, there was a lot to talk about, and they started expressing their desire for travel, but how they hadn't been allowed to even say that before, and was it safe now? And it was really the realization that what they wanted to do was to better understand the world and to have a more secure place in it, which I think at some point is a pretty universal human desire, and one that we tend to talk about in unguarded moments, but don't often talk about like in a job interview.
Yeah.
And that was why it was so, I liked that they wanted to have a picnic instead of just, a conversation in which we talked about how much they would get paid.
When it's interesting too that this element of needing to create this container, this space where I feel safe, right?
Yeah.
And then that I feel safe, and then we're doing something, and you're willing to come into my world and do my cultural practices and eat my
Yeah.
food and drink my alcohol
Yeah.
and celebrate how I celebrate. And then that slowly easing into that level of comfort where I open up and share with you what's really most important to me under the surface. Even though we're talking about this job, what I really
Yeah.
care about is my family, my future, and my optimism.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's so the I think it's so important to sort of double click on this word safety, because yes, we want psychological safety. Psychological safety is really important to teams, um, sort of being able to succeed, being able to care about each other, and being able to succeed together. And at the same time, I think a lot of radical candor is actually about pushing through the discomfort. And ironically, I think a lot of psychological safety is about being willing to push through the discomfort. Very often it doesn't feel safe, but silence also doesn't feel safe. It's something Amy Evanson and I have talked a lot about. There's nothing that feels psychologically safe about wondering where you stand.
Yeah. And that's what, when I remember, I want to say it was maybe 20, because Radical Candor came out in 2017.
Yes.
I want to say I remember like standing on a trip. I think I was living in Santiago, Chile at the time, and I
Hmm.
remember being at the airport. I think I picked it up and I was standing there reading, and I think I said thank you out loud. I got like 10 pages in and then went bought it. And I never buy books actually in the airport, right? And I think I actually just bought it right there because it was the first time that I had seen somebody directly acknowledge the interplay between praise and criticism and caring personally and giving feedback for our relationships, and that both of those things were equally necessary to establish that psychological safety and that trust. And that's why I was just like, I was like, this is what's been needed. And I was also a little frustrated because I was like,
you.
I wanted to acknowledge this, and I'm never going to write a book that's going to be this good, right?
You will. You
I,
will
I
write a book.
that's
You
the
are
goal,
writing a book.
hopefully. So Kim, I guess what I want to know is that, you've gone through this extremely interesting career, and what was the moment where this idea kind of, because I'm guessing it bubbled up in Russia, it bubbled up in Kosovo, it bubbled up in Google and
Yeah.
working with CEOs. So when did you decide this needs to be a book, and I'm going to commit the 4 years that I know you said you talked about before it took to write this?
Yeah, I wish I could say there was a moment of decision, but when I sat down to write the book, I thought I could write it in 3 months. That was the commitment I was making to myself. It was just that as I got into it, I was like, oh, this is more interesting and more fun than I thought it would be, but it's also going to take 4 years, not 3 months. I think that I'll tell you a couple of stories. Probably the seed got planted back in 2000 when I had started this software company, and I came into work one day and about 10 people had sent me the same article about how people would rather have a boss who's a total, am I allowed to curse?
You just say whatever
Okay.
you want.
Okay. They would rather have a boss who's a total asshole but really competent than one who's really incompetent but nice.
Mhm.
And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm an asshole or because they think I'm incompetent? And surely those are not my two choices, you know?
Let's hope
Uh,
not.
yes, let's hope not. That is a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
And, I went to business school. I learned exactly nothing about management at business school, but I did learn that a 2x2 is a great way to resolve a false dichotomy. And so that was kind of when I started playing with this idea. And I think it came into focus for me shortly after I joined Google. I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there was one of the founders on an elliptical trainer wearing toe shoes in a bright blue spandex unitard. Not what I was expecting or wanting to see in the room. And there was the CEO doing his email like his brain had been plugged into his machine. So probably like you in such a situation, I felt a little bit nervous. How was I supposed to get these people's attention? Luckily, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added, the CEO almost fell off his chair. What did you say? This is incredible. Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineering resources? So I'm thinking the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And I walked out of the room. I walked past my boss, and I'm expecting from her a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, she says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I thought, oh, wow, I screwed something up in there. And I'm sure I'm
Here it
about to hear
comes.
about it. Yeah. But I was open to hearing about it from her because she had solicited feedback from me and rewarded it. So I knew she was going to be coming from a good place. And she began the conversation as she tended to do, not by focusing on the bad stuff, but by focusing on the good stuff. But of course, all I wanted to hear about was what I had done wrong. She did this, by the way, not in the shit sandwich sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she said.
Want to
But
talk
all
about that more later on.
yeah, exactly. But all I wanted to hear about was what had gone wrong. And eventually she said to me, you said a lot in there. Were you aware of it? And with this, I kind of breathed a sigh of relief and made a brush off gesture with my hand. And I said, yeah, I know. It's no big deal, really. And then she said, I know a great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction? And once again, I made a brush off gesture with my hand. I said, no, I'm busy. I don't have time for a speech coach. And then she stopped and she looked right at me, right in the eye. And she said, I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say that I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, this is a really important point, she never would have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps a better listener than I was. But she knew me well enough to know that if she didn't use just those words, she wasn't going to get my attention. And she also knew that I wasn't going to be crushed if she used those words with me. And so when she said that, I realized I should go to see the speech coach, and I did. And I learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me because I had been giving presentations my whole career. I had raised a lot of money for 2 different startups giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. And this got me to thinking 2 things, really. One, why hadn't nobody told me? And 2, what was it about my boss that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? And as I thought about her management style, I realized it really boiled down to 2 things. It was care personally and challenge directly. And when you can do both at the same time, that is radical candor. So that was probably the moment, although I still didn't have the words. It took me another 6 years or 8 years.
So what was that progression? Like, I have about 20 questions off of what you just shared, but what was the progression for you to have that moment that kind of stuck out for you? And then to slowly progress into this model that you've created? What were there different iterations along the way where you finally synthesized it down? And I love that you started in diamond cutting, because you have this like raw stone and then you have this beautiful precious piece in the end, cutting off all the unnecessary
right
stuff.
Angles. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So were there different iterations before you came to, and I'm actually going to pull it up now. I Let me see if I can get up on my backdrop.
There you
Your
go.
model here that
Very
you have.
nice. Yeah, there were a bunch of different iterations. One, I sort of took a step in the direction of this model when I did at Google. They did this thing called the Energy Project,
Yes.
and which is a great book. The author is fantastic, and he had a 2x2, which was high, I think it was like high energy and low. You
This
wanted to be
Schwartzman. Who is the?
yes,
Yes.
Schwartzman.
Here's Schwartzman.
I think that's his name.
I'll look it up and
Look it up, yes,
I'll
and
put a
cut
link
all
to it
this
in the
out where I
video
don't
description.
remember his
Yeah.
name. I'm terrible with
I'll
names.
find it. I'll find it.
But anyway, he had a 2x2 that was great. And in fact, he offered us, he gave us this magnetic board where people could walk by your office and put the little figures where they thought you were that day. It was a good feedback system. So I started thinking, but that wasn't quite what I was talking about. And then when I was at Apple, I worked with a great team of people, and we designed this class called Managing at Apple. And there, the 2x2 was smiley face to frowny face and unclear to clear. And that was pretty good, but it wasn't quite right. I mean, the upper, you wanted to be in the lower right-hand quadrant, which is all wrong if you're if you're familiar with how 2x2s are usually used. But it also kind of left too much room for confusion for folks. And then when I decided to write the book, I'll never forget it. I spent about 3 months just playing with this 2x2. That was all I did. My husband, who's a software engineer, he walked by me one day, and I'm like making all these charts, all these keynote graphs. And he said, I could build a random word generator for you. Would that be helpful? That's what it looked like I was doing from his perspective. And I knew that I was on to something. There was a woman who I worked with at Google named Ellen Konar, one of the smartest people I ever worked with. And I would send her versions of it. She's like, I don't like it. I don't like it. And then one day I sent her this one, and with Care Personally, Challenge Directly, I still hadn't thought of the words radical candor, but I had the axes labeled. And she replied, I'll never forget it. She replied, she said, I'd be interested in having a conversation with someone about this. And I knew I was onto something. And for the longest time, I was calling radical candor tough love, because I didn't have a better phrase for it. And I gave a talk at a Qualtrics summit one time. And after the talk, I was in the elevator with Dan Pink, who had also he wrote Drive and
Oh yeah, amazing.
Win and To Sell is Human, a lot of great books. And he said to me, I really liked your talk, but tough love is just not quite right. And somewhere between the first and the 14th floor, we came up with radical candor. So that's how it happened. You just got to keep kind of noodling. It's like a dog with a bone.
Looking.
Yeah.
Well, until you get something that resonates with people. And I'll never remember. I did an interview with Liz Weissman.
Yes, I love her.
And I
She's
remember
great.
her saying, she goes, one of the keys to writing a book is that you want to create a language that people feel like they have to read the book to understand it.
Yeah.
Because then you're creating a message and saying, oh, what is this? And then it asks me a question. What is radical candor?
Yeah.
And so why these two axes that you have here, this caring personally and challenging directly? Could you explain, how would you summarize caring personally and challenging directly?
So caring personally is sort of what I think of as the give a damn dimension of radical candor. And it's interesting to think about what moves us down on that dimension, because I've never met anyone who says, I don't give a damn about other people, so I'm going to be a great leader, a great employee, a great colleague. That's not, most people actually really do sort of instinctively care about one another. And I think the problem here begins when we're sort of 18, 19, 20 years old. We're right at that moment when our egos are sort of maximally fragile and our personas are beginning to solidify. And right at that moment, someone will come along and they'll say, be professional. And I think an awful lot of us translate that to mean, without even realizing what we're doing, leave your emotions, leave who you really are, leave your humanity, leave everything that's best about you at home and show up at work like some kind of robot. And you can't possibly care personally if you're showing up at work like some kind of robot. So I think that's part of what happens on that dimension. Whereas on the challenge directly dimension, I think the problem begins not when we're 18, 19, 20 years old, but when we're, 18 months old. We're just learning to speak, and we have a parent who says to us some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And now all of a sudden it's your job to say it. Congratulations. And this is really hard. It's hard to give voice to sort of undo training that's been pounded into you since you were 18 years old, and even harder to undo training that's been pounded into you since you were 18 months old. And so one of the things that I've done to try to make it a little bit easier is to name what happens when we fail on one dimension or another, as we are all bound to do, and to try to give it names that don't feel too much like judgments, right? So when you challenge directly, but you forget to show that you care personally, I call that obnoxious aggression.
What's an example of that, Kim? Of being obnoxiously aggressive?
Yeah, I mean, yelling at someone, screaming at someone, criticizing them in public. If you think about a simple example like spinach in your teeth, yelling across the table, look at Kim, I guess she's saving up her leftovers for later, and then if you think about it in terms of more, that's an easy example. We all know that's we know the right thing to do is to tell the person about the spinach in their teeth, but not to yell at them. But if you think about it in terms of your career, like I will give you an example of me being obnoxiously aggressive. I had just joined Google, and I got into an argument with one of the founders about an AdSense policy. And I sent an email, by the way. Sending it in email was my first mistake. You should always have these conversations in person. And I sent it not only to him, but to 30 other people. And that was a second mistake. I should have criticized in private, not in public. And I said, Larry claims he wants to organize the world's information, but if it'll make us a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. So that's an example of
that was bold. I got to give it to you.
Yeah.
Was that being radically candid?
No, that was obnoxious aggression. That's my example of obnoxious aggression. And I think I did that in part because I believe, like I bet you do too, that there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that doing the exact opposite is such a brilliant move. It doesn't mean you get to kick up. Common human decency, respect is the one thing that we owe to everyone, regardless of who they are in the organization. I think sometimes people, if you want to know where the floor is on the care personally dimension, it should be at respect. Once you fall below respect, you're in obnoxious aggression or manipulative insincerity.
So the term, Kim, and sorry to interrupt you, but I want to pause on that word for a second, because it's such a word that gets thrown around, and it's a different experience for each person, right? Is that feeling respected? If that's the line, right? How do we understand each other's line, right? Like that moment of like, I think I'm being respectful by giving you feedback, and to that other person, what are you talking about? That was offensive. You're being obnoxiously aggressive. So how do you understand that line with somebody and build a relationship where they hear it as I'm being respectful by giving you feedback, like what Sheryl did to you, and not taking it as I am personally attacking you?
Yeah. You can't control how the other person is going to take what you say. That's the bad news. Radical candor gets measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And so if the listener thinks you're being obnoxiously aggressive, guess what? You need to adjust how you're talking so that you're not so that you're not impacting that other person in this way. So if you say something and a person seems sad or mad, that's your cue to move up a little bit on the care personally dimension. But very often what our instinct is when a person seems sad or mad is it's to go the wrong way on challenge directly and to wind up in ruinous empathy. But there's another thing that'll happen is sometimes you'll say something to the person and they'll kind of brush you off the way I did to my boss. And that's when you want to actually go further out than you may be comfortable going on the challenge directly dimension of radical candor.
And what would be going further out on that? What's an example of ruinous empathy and also manipulative?
Okay. So when you back off,
If you go back off,
yeah,
yeah.
if you go the wrong way on, it's so hard, like with these hand gestures, because
Exactly the opposite. You have to go the
yes.
opposite of where you want to go.
Yes,
I'm pointing to the
exactly.
chart here, but it's on the other side.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. So what does it look like when you zoom towards ruinous empathy, when you go the wrong way on challenge directly? You want another story? You ready for
Sure,
another
I
story?
would love one.
I'm going to give you a long story that explains what I mean by ruinous empathy. So I had just hired this guy, we'll call him Bob. And I liked Bob a lot. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He would do stuff like we were at a manager offsite. We were playing one of those endless get to know you games. And Bob was the guy who had the courage to raise his hand and to say, I could tell everybody's stressed out. I've got an idea. It'll help us get to know each other and it'll be really fast. Whatever his idea was, if it was fast, we were down with it. And Bob says, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. Really weird, but really fast. Weirder yet, we all remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just a right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So we all liked Bob. He was kind of quirky, but he brought some levity to the office. The problem with Bob, one problem, was that he was doing terrible work, absolutely terrible work. I was so puzzled because he had this incredible resume. I learned much later the problem was he was smoking pot in the bathroom 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy that he had all the time. But I didn't know any of that at the time. So he would hand stuff into me, shame in his eyes. And I would say to him something along the lines of, oh, Bob, you're so awesome. This is a great start. Maybe you could make it just a little bit better, right? So I'm going the wrong way on challenge directly. And why am I going the wrong way on challenge directly? Mostly it's ruinous empathy because I really do care about Bob and I really don't want to hurt his feelings. That's kind of at the essence of what ruinous empathy is. But if I'm honest with myself, there was something more insidious going on as well because Bob was popular. And Bob was sensitive. And part of me was afraid if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't nearly good enough, that he would get upset. He might even start to cry. And then everybody would think I was a big you-know-what. So the part of me that was worried about my reputation as a leader, that's the manipulative insincerity part. The part of me that was worried about not hurting Bob's feelings, that was the ruinous empathy part. And this goes on for 10 months. And eventually the inevitable happens. And I realize that I'm going to lose all my best performers if I don't fire Bob. And so I sat down to start a conversation that I should have begun with him 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he kind of pushed his chair back from the table. He looked me right in the eye and he said, why didn't you tell me? And as that was going around in my head with no good answer, he said, why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me. And now I realize that by not telling him, thinking I was being so nice, he's now getting fired as a result of it. Not so nice after all. And that's ruinous empathy in a nutshell.
That element where we hold back the gift of giving somebody a window into what they're not seeing and forgetting that that's actually caring, right?
Yeah.
Is that our relationships. And that's what's, I think is so interesting about the work you're doing. And when I think about it, I think I shared in the email when we were connecting that my background was conflict resolution and similar. And so I used to facilitate dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians and Indians, Pakistanis, and worked a lot in the Republic of Georgia and between folks from Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so we had the same, most of our time was sitting, this is all track 2 diplomacy work. So this is people, journalists and historians coming together to have these conversations. And the big shift for me, and it's funny because I think I heard in one of the interviews that you had a moment where somebody CC'd you on an email that was not so
Yes.
kind to you.
Yeah.
I had the same thing happen. That was my kind of life-changing moment where my coworker Phil from Armenia emailed my coworker Jali from Azerbaijan saying, "Screw Chris, it's better he's upset than we are." So I was being a real
Wow.
jerk, and he CC'd me on it by accident. And so we
Wow.
knew we had this conflict and this dynamic, and we had to work through this. And we were conflict resolution specialists. That was the irony,
Right.
but we couldn't resolve the dynamic. And then we put ourselves, at the location. This was a State Department funded program, and this one was being run in the US. And we put ourselves on a floating dock in the middle of a lake. And we said, we're not getting off this till we resolve the dynamic. And we used every model of conflict, hopes, needs, fears, concerns,
Yeah.
talked for like 9 hours. We resolved it.
Wow.
By the next day, we were fighting again. And no matter what we did, we kept on going into the cycle. And it wasn't until that night when I tried this recognition activity where I asked my coworker, Jali from Australia, said, "What do you want to be acknowledged for?" She goes, "Nothing, Chris. I'm not doing this stupid American stuff." And I go, "What do you want to be acknowledged for?" And she goes, "Nothing." And so I'm like, "I'm not going to stop asking you." And she told me, she's like, "On the break today, all the participants came up and told me I was a traitor to my country." And I immediately, in an instant, completely changed my whole relationship to who this person was, right? And to all that stuff that I hadn't spoke up, hadn't shared, and hadn't got to know her. But I realized that I couldn't care for her if I didn't know who she was. And she couldn't be straight with me because I had closed the door to her communication and I had written her
Wow.
off. And that's when I realized that like this element of building relationships is the heart of people being receptive to feedback.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I'm curious from you is this caring personally, how did Sheryl build the relationship with you where you were receptive to that feedback? Right? Because caring personally is not a one-off thing where I bring you M&Ms because that was what your
Yeah.
parents potty trained you on. Like, how
Hershey
do I
Kisses. Hershey Kisses,
Hershey
please.
Kisses is what it was. Okay. Okay. So Hershey Kisses, so how did she build that relationship so you were receptive to that feedback?
Yeah, there's a real order of operations to Radical Candor, and as I mentioned, it all started with her being willing to hear feedback from me. So it always starts, no matter who you are, but especially if you're the leader, you've got to solicit feedback, and you've got to prove that you can take it before you dish it out. You've got to literally accept the gift before you're free to give the gift. I think that is really important, but it doesn't have to be this long drawn out process. In fact, for me, the origin story of Radical Candor happened in the space of time it took a light to change on the street of Manhattan. So I had just gotten this puppy, and I loved this puppy, and I loved her so much that I had never said a cross word to her, and she's totally out of control. She jumped in front of a car. I pulled her out of the way in the nick of time. And this man on the street corner looked at me and he said to me, "I can tell you really love that dog." That was all he had to do to move up on the care personally dimension. He didn't have to know my kids' names or even my name or birthday or take me out to lunch. Very often, caring personally is about noticing the other person's humanity in the moment. It's not this huge, long process. And but then this guy says to me, "But you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach her to sit." And then he pointed at the ground in this kind of harsh gesture and he said, "Sit." The dog sat. Had no idea she even knew what that meant. And I kind of looked at him in amazement and he said, "It's not mean, it's clear." And then the light changed and he walked off, leaving me with words to live by. So I really think that caring personally is largely about those moments, the moment to moment thing. There's not like some, you have to, I mean, it's useful, I think, in the course of time to have these sort of career conversations and these get to know you conversations, and to lock yourself on the on the island for a while and
Yeah.
talk. But it can start with in very small ways. In fact, Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel for a long time, was being interviewed by a journalist about what it meant to be a good mentor. And he and I used to take a walk every so often, and he told me that the journalist had talked to somebody who said that Andy Grove was like the most important mentor in his life. And Andy said, I barely remembered this person. I just took a cab from the airport once with this person and had a conversation. And he said, I just listened to what they were saying and responded. It was not you can have a really big impact in just a few moments with someone.
Amazing. Do you know Mark Goldstein?
I don't.
He wrote the book Just Listen,
Mm-hmm.
and has been a mentor of mine, and it's phenomenal book. And he's got a line in there which I absolutely love, which is, it's less important that what we say to others than what we empower others to say to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so much just that fact that we asked a question and we took time to listen to the answer, or we followed up on what that person said, sends ripples to that person, that we signals to them that we care. And I spend most of my time training people in recognition. People always think I'm supposed to say the right thing, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want it to be seen as buttering them up or manipulating them or something. And I'm like, stop trying to say the right thing. Just ask someone how they're doing and listen. And that can go a lot farther than anything else.
Yeah, it's really important. It's important also to remember that people already have a voice. You're not giving people a voice. They have a voice. What you're doing is you're not shutting them down. You're learning about the things you're doing that, without meaning to, that shut people down.
So how do leaders establish that? You said that one of the ways that I show people that I care personally is I seek feedback myself.
Yeah.
So how do you get one thing that I hear from a lot of people is, my boss is really reactive, or I don't know how they're going to respond, so I don't give them feedback. I want to bring this up, but because I don't know who I'm going to get every time I walk into their office, or they get defensive every time, I don't want to give feedback. So what are your recommendations in situations like that?
If you're the leader, how not to do that, or if you have
why don't we go with, if you're the leader, how not to do that, and then if you're an
and then we'll
employee
talk
and
about
that's your leader, what can you do?
So if you're a leader, or if no matter who you are, this is the place to start with radical candor, is to ask the question and really give some thought to the question you're going to ask. A question that I like is, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? But don't write down my question, because if you sound like Kim Scott and not like yourself, people won't believe you want the answer. So think about how you're going to ask it. I was working with Krista Quarles when she was the CEO of Open Table. And she said, Kim, I could never imagine your words coming out of my mouth. She said, the question I like to ask is, tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, that's fine too. You can ask it in a way that feels authentic to you, but it's not only you that matters. It's also the other person. So there were a couple of people on Krista's team where she had to tone it down because they felt that question was too sort of aggressive. I started this company with Jason Rosoff called Radical Candor. And after we had worked together for a little while, Jason told me, I hate your go-to question, Kim. It's too vague. It's too open-ended. I don't know what to say. And so you've got to ask the question, but also be willing to remember that radical candor gets measured not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear. So if the other person doesn't like your question, adjust it. The second thing, if everybody that is listening to us talk can stop right now, pull out a pen and write down your question, who you're going to ask it of, and when you're going to ask it, our time today will be very well spent. So think about what your question is. Really give it some thought. But the bad news about your great question that you just thought of is that no matter how good it is, the other person still does not want to answer it. They are going to be uncomfortable. And the only way out of this discomfort is through. It does not feel safe to answer, no matter how there are no words in the language, especially if you're someone's boss, that will make them feel safe to answer. The only way that you can get an answer is to embrace the discomfort. Simple tactic here: close your mouth and count to 6.
And wait for them to go. And I'm always reminded, I stumbled on some research and I ended up interviewing the person. I think her name is, now I'm just blanking on her name. I wrote it down. It's somewhere.
You caught my.
I got it, and I can't remember her name is, but she did an article on it, Tali Rake, I think, and it was talking about emotional ambivalence.
Mm-hmm.
And she used a term in there. She goes, one of the reasons why many people stay emotionally ambivalent on either side is because of outcome uncertainty. And what I realized is I love the term outcome uncertainty, because when I ask people, why do you hesitate to recognize people? I'm not sure how they're going to respond. I don't want them to think I'm hitting on them. I don't want them to think I am talking down to them. Why do you avoid giving feedback? Outcome uncertainty. I'm not sure how they're going to
Yeah.
respond, but I'm reminded of every time is all of the places where we build relationships is when we're willing to have the conversations that are uncomfortable to have,
Yeah.
right? It's
And so
that.
and it's not enough to listen in
Mhm.
order to move past that outcome uncertainty. The next thing you have to do is you have to listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. So like it's sort of a discomfort triple scoop, right? The first thing is your own discomfort to hear it. So you got to overcome that to ask. And then you've got to overcome the other person's discomfort to tell you the thing. And now the third level of discomfort is happening, which is you're hearing the thing and you probably feel defensive. And that doesn't mean that you're shut down to feedback or lesser mortal. It just means that you're human and it's hard to hear criticism, especially when you're the boss and you kind of feel like you're supposed to be getting everything right. I don't know why we feel that way as a boss, but we often do. And so the thing that you could do to make sure you're listening with the intent to understand, not to respond, is to state back what you think you heard, because you maybe heard the wrong thing, or to ask a couple of follow-up questions. So for example, my daughter said to me, I wish you weren't the radical candor lady, one morning at breakfast, a little unsolicited feedback. And immediately this wave of parental guilt washed over me. And I thought, oh, she wishes that I were spending more time with her. I feel so guilty. And then I thought, well, I should make sure I understand what she's trying to say to me. And I said, well, who do you wish I were? And she said, I wish you were the lady who minded her own business. So I could work a little more as far as she was. So you want to make sure that you really take the time to understand what the other person said. But even now that you've understood, it's not enough just to say thank you. That will feel like a brush off. You've got to reward the candor. So if you agree with the feedback, then you got to fix the problem and be kind of theatrical about how you fix the problem and ask for more feedback. Did I overcorrect? Did I not go far enough? But if you disagree with the feedback, that's tricky, right? Because now you've just asked the feedback and the person had the courage to give it to you and you disagree. What do you do in that case? In that case, what you do is you look for the 5 or 10% of whatever they said that you can agree with and give voice to that. And then say, I want to get back to you. I want to think about the rest of it and then get back to you. And if you're truly not defensive, you can get back to them immediately. But usually we need to take a breath and then get back to them. And then you've got to go in and have the disagreement. And that is tricky. That is really tricky because I think we have this feeling that a disagreement is going to pose a risk to our relationship, but it's usually not disagreement that poses a risk to our, it's unspoken disagreement that builds up and builds up and builds up and then explodes in unpredictable and unproductive ways. But very often, some of the best relationships I had in my career started with a respectful disagreement.
What you just shared right there, it's one thing that I see when it comes to like conflict in the workplace, and I think why I've gone so much, and I always say that recognition is conflict prevention, but recognition, I don't break it into, people usually collapse rewards and awards with that. And I'm trying to break it out into recognition of things we do that have people feel seen and valued at work.
Yeah,
and that's
praise.
starting at the top, which is appreciating the person. Right.
Yeah.
And appreciating the person for who they are, what they contribute, and what it takes to do their job each day, which means that we're doing regular things to signal them that we value them, which is taking their feedback, taking action on it, asking them how they're doing. And when people are receptive, it seems that people are only going to be receptive to people who they feel value them. And they're going to hedge against, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, and they're going to hedge against, or they're going to be defensive against someone they feel doesn't value them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because if someone doesn't value you, or if you feel like they're using feedback as a way to assert dominance, like that's not a gift, that's a punishment, that kind of feedback.
And so it doesn't actually contribute to that. And so that person shuts down and you can't have, because I feel like when you feel valued at work, you relate to tough conversations as part of our relationship. And if you don't feel valued, it's toxicity.
Yeah. So if step number one in the radical candor order of operations is to solicit
Mhm.
criticism, step number two is to give praise,
Yeah.
to give voice to the things that you appreciate about working with that other person.
Yeah, and I love, and I want to point this out. And I think that this is in your book. One of the things I loved is this chart you put in there about you have guidance, which is praise and criticism, and that there's a balance of getting it from, which is first, giving it
Yes.
to, and then encouraging between. And I
Yes.
love that you put this out. And that's one of the ones I think I took a picture of it and shared it with a friend right away. I'm like, this is what I'm talking about. You need both. And many times people fall into, quoting the Gottman research about the 3-to-1 ratio, or the 5-to-1 ratio, the 7-to-1
Yeah.
ratio, which I use to give people a number. But there's often the fallacy that, okay, yeah, I give 3 compliments, so now I can give 1 tough feedback. What is your thoughts on that and about the balance?
Yeah, so praise is not just the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. Like, praise is important in its own right. Praise does more than show you care personally. It also challenges the person to do more of the good thing, right? So praise needs to be radically candid, as well as criticism doesn't only challenge directly. Good criticism, you're offering it because you care. So you need to show you care when you're offering it. And I think that the key thing about praise and criticism is you want to focus on the good stuff. Like, I totally agree with the research that says you should give more praise than criticism. But the problem is that when you try to boil it down to a metric, people will do something like say, "Oh, Kim, I love your bookshelf. Your talk is kind of boring, but I like the orange sweater." And like, that does not make me feel any better. So you want to make sure that your praise has real meaning, that your praise is specific and sincere, and that your criticism is kind and clear.
Yeah. And what is that balance like? So why you have get from, give to, encourage between. Now,
Right.
as a leader, what does encourage between mean?
So encouraging sort of praise and criticism between people on the team means that you want to make sure that you're creating vehicles for people to praise each other, because people are reluctant to praise one another. I mean, I'm sure there's a million reasons why, but one of them, there was a really interesting study about movie critics. And it turns out that people rate movie critics who pan the movie as smarter than movie critics who love the movie. And so you want to remind people that to give each other praise and to do it in a way that is public and joyful. Some techniques for encouraging people to give each other praise are simple things like, I used to bring a big stuffed whale to or stuffed, one time it was a whale, another time it was a golden retriever puppy, and I would bring it to the all hands, and I would encourage people to share the incredible things that they had seen others do publicly in every single all hands meeting that we had, and we had those once a week. So that was one way. At Google, they had this peer recognition system where you could give anyone $100. They actually put money in. Not every company has money blowing out of the air conditioning vents the way that Google did. Doesn't have to be $100, but just putting something behind it. So those are some sort of praise tools. There's some incredible tools out there that will help you do this.
And just
then,
like what you're saying is to make it a priority to, hey, we need to incorporate this into what we're doing consciously.
Yeah. You need to create a platform that encourages people to give each other praise, because people don't naturally do it. Actually,
No, I found in my original study, I interviewed 400 people in the subway in Boston, and number one thing people associated with being recognized was feeling valued, but 70% or more associate embarrassment or discomfort with the process. And so we avoid what we're uncomfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. So you got to encourage, I mean, you've got to give praise yourself, obviously, but you got to encourage between. And then you've got to make sure that you're doing what you can to encourage people to talk to each other directly when they have
Yeah.
criticism.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things you can do as a leader, but I think one of the most important one is to prevent backstabbing. So don't let one person come and talk to you badly about another person who's not in the room. It's so simple. And yet very often leaders make this mistake. They think they're being the empathetic leader. They think they're like a shuttle diplomat. In these situations, you are not a shuttle diplomat. You're more like a marriage counselor, and you are not allowed to talk to one person unless the other person is in the room. Unless, of course, it's something like sexual harassment, at which point you
Yeah.
got to handle it differently.
Yeah. Kim, I want to on the realm of harassment. I don't want to step over your most recent book because I got it when I actually, be honest, I have had Radical Candor and I had seen that other book come out. I hadn't got it yet, and when I reached out and you mentioned, hey, I'd love to talk about this book too, I've been listening to it nonstop for the last 5 days. You've been with me on I've been walking in the woods and mountain biking a lot more recently so I could listen to more of it. So what I'm curious about is, what was it that sparked you? You'd written Radical Candor, and that you also wrote this, if I understand right, you started writing it in 2017.
Yeah, I started writing it almost immediately. It took another
So
4
long
years.
before Breonna Taylor, before George Floyd, before
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter, before the racial injustice movement, before everybody was talking about DEI as a major thing, what was it that sparked you to write this, and why is this so important right now for building cultures where people feel included?
So shortly after Radical Candor came out, I was at a tech company in San Francisco giving a Radical Candor talk. And the CEO of that company was someone who I had worked with for the better part of a decade, a person who I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, or frankly in any other sector. And when I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture that I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And then she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I realized there was a major gap in Radical Candor. I hadn't considered the extent to which bias, prejudice, and bullying often masquerade as feedback. And I also I hadn't considered sort of the different roles that I had played in my career. As her colleague, I had not been the kind of upstander that I envisioned myself to be. I had not even noticed the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly pleasant and cheerful in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though, believe me, she had what to be ticked off about in that period of time, as we all do at work. And so I wrote part of Just Work from the perspective of the upstander. But the other thing I realized sort of in that one moment was that I had also been sort of in denial about a whole host of things that had happened to me as a woman in the workplace. And hard for the author of a book called Candor to admit. But I had pretended that a bunch of things were not happening that were in fact happening. I think in part because I don't like to think of myself as a victim, but even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, that I want to think of myself as a culprit. And I realized that I was most deeply in denial about the ways in which I had caused harm to other people in the workplace. And so I wrote the book from the point of view of the upstander, the person who was harmed, the person who caused harm, and also the leader, because as a leader, you know, I sort of imagined I was creating these bullshit-free zones. And I had to realize that I had not confronted bias, prejudice, and bullying to the extent that I wished that I had in retrospect as a leader.
It sounds like you had created that zone, but you'd created that zone that was safe for one group of people.
Yes.
And not necessarily safe for every group of people.
Yeah. And not even always safe for the one group of people, actually. So that's the problem. We can't address these problems except in solidarity. I think I couldn't write about being a white woman in the workplace without writing about the experiences that colleagues of mine who are not white women had.
Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm not going to share the stories that are in it, but I remember just thinking, I was like, why did Kim Scott write this book? And I was like, this is really different. And then I remember I was about probably 20 minutes in and my mouth was just dropping. I was like, holy, and I'm not going to say it out loud, but I was just like the things that you lived through and the bravery to share it. And then I don't want to say systematic, because systematic always sounds bad, but to create a framework for both understanding the role we've played, how we can support people, and then also the concrete, like giving people scripts to be able to interrupt things and take action in their workplace in it's like a manual, right? It's like a manual that's just like, you can just be like, okay, yeah, oh, this just happened. Okay, this is what I can say.
Here's this page. Yeah. And I tried to write it that way. It was the manual I wish that I had had early in my career when all this terrible stuff was happening, because it's bewildering when these things happen to people. And it's also bewildering when you're the leader and you've started this company and you sort of imagine that you started the company because you're going to prevent all these terrible things from happening, and then they happen anyway. And so I really wanted to help everyone try to like fix this problem, because I really do think we're at this moment in history when there's there's still plenty of denial to go around, but there's greater recognition of the problems of sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia
Mhm.
and religious intolerance. There's greater recognition of these problems, and there's, I think, greater determination to really do something about them than there has been in the past. But there's also a lot of exhaustion with these problems because it's been so difficult to put some wins on the board. And so I don't imagine that Just Work has all the answers, but I do hope that it'll help us all put some wins on the board.
And Kim, how do we keep that conversation alive? Now, one thing and I kind of want to wrap up with this question today, and it's a big question, and I could take another 4 hours of your time today, and I know that would be selfish of me to do. But you've worked internally with management training. You have your own company that does this. You're talking about moving the needle on a human behavior that people avoid. Now, how do you keep these conversations alive? And now you're an external person coming in and supporting companies. And you know what? It's the flavor of the month. We're going to talk about feedback this month. Okay, it's the flavor of the month. We're gonna change the color of our logo for a month because something just happened in our area, and then it disappears. How do you see companies effectively move the needle and institutionalize this and make it part of their soul opposed to something that happens in reaction to something else?
Yeah, I mean, behavior change is really tricky. And it's no joke. And what I've tried to do with both Radical Candor and Just Work is give people specific small things that they can do to start putting a big idea into practice.
Mhm.
And I think the key thing is to take it a little bit at a time. Like unconscious bias training, I think is really interesting and really useful. But unless you feel that you have the tools that you need to address the specific bias that you saw in the meeting, and I'm going to wave, I use purple flag to address bias, and I just said saw, and what I meant was notice. So one of the things that someone pointed out to me as I wrote the book is that I tend to use sloppy site metaphors, ableist language.
Mhm.
And I really care about this. And in fact, one of the people who helped me edit the book is a historian who's blind. And
Mhm.
so I really didn't want, as I wrote the book, to use language that was in some way harmful to him. And so I thought I was aware of it, right? And when right before I turned the book in, I did a search, and I found in a 350-page book 99 sloppy site metaphors, and I still use them to this day. And I have to wave but it's useful to be able to use some small gesture to point out specific things. And I use fewer sloppy site metaphors than I used to, but I'm still not perfect. We have to be patient and persistent with ourselves.
What I heard that you just shared there, which I've heard you share multiple times, is that invitation for you to call me on something, invitation to give me feedback, invitation
Yes.
to I am committed to growing here, and I want you to call me on it when I do it. And then I'm
Yeah.
going to check in to say, hey, am I doing it? And here's a fun way for you to interrupt me when I say that thing that I just said I was committed to not saying.
Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
the only way we can bring play to the behavior change and also show our commitment to the person that we care to make the change and to change our work environment to support them.
Yeah. And to show respect for the person, even as we're challenging the person's mistake. The person's mistake does not define the whole person.
Amazing. So Kim, my last question for you is if you run trainings, you run workshops, if you could click a button and know that one idea would stay in people's mind and they'd act on it, what would be that one thing?
It would be soliciting criticism. This desire to solicit criticism from the people around you. That's the one thing. If we can all do that, the world will be a better place.
Excellent. Kim, thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. And where can people find you?
They can find me at radicalcandor.com. They can find me at justworktogether.com. And increasingly on LinkedIn. Twitter, I'm finding less and less useful every single day.
I am with you. LinkedIn's my place where I hang out too. Kim, thank you so
Yes.
much for taking the time to speak today. Have an
Thank you.
amazing day.